Hello, friends. We've all watched Squid Game with bated breath, a series about a dark world where poverty-stricken people play a game to the death and the rich watch them as entertainment. But what if I told you that this story happened in real life? Today, I'm taking you to 1980s South Korea, where the brothers' home scandal was one of the worst human rights abuses in modern history. And I'm afraid it was much darker than the Squid Game. The background of the period, the dark side of South Korea. In the 1980s, a general named Chun Do-hwan came to power in a military coup. He ruled the country with a harsh iron fist. Freedoms were curtailed, journalists were silenced, and dissidents were jailed. But you know what was really scary? The policies implemented in the name of maintaining social order. It was during this period that the South Korean government began to take people off the streets who society considered misfits. The homeless, beggars, those without ID, the mentally handicapped. Sometimes even innocent people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time were included in this operation. Where did they take these people? This facility in Brothers' Home was being promoted by the government as a rehabilitation center. On paper, it was supposed to provide basic needs like shelter, food, and education. It was even referred to in official documents as a good home where the homeless were reintegrated into society. With a capacity of 500 people, what actually happened in this place? In total, more than 4,000 people were locked up here at that time. Most of them were people who had been taken off the street completely illegally, whose families hadn't even been notified, or who had been targeted by the police. These brothers' home became a kind of human garbage dump. And the most disturbing thing is that the rest of society didn't know what was going on. The government presented the existence of these facilities as a success story. Streets were being cleaned, community order was being restored. But who was paying for this order, friends? The truth inside Brothers' Home was the exploitation not only of the homeless, but of the conscience of a nation. How could such a massive operation remain secret for so long? This is where the power of authoritarian regimes lies. Now, let's look inside, behind the walls of Brothers' Home. Are you ready to meet the people who are trying to survive here? Let's see the inhumane conditions behind the dark doors of Brothers' Home by going behind these cold walls. What was presented on the outside as a rehabilitation center was, in fact, a place of inhumanity. Let's open the door to this hell together. Let's first take a look at how crowded this facility was. The official capacity was only 500 people, but there were more than 4,000 people inside. In other words, hundreds of people were stacked on top of each other in wards that could barely fit one person. Beds? Forget it. Most people had to lie side by side on the floor. Hygiene? No hygiene either. Water would not flow for weeks, and people used the pits they dug in communal areas as toilets. Epidemics were almost a part of everyday life. In Brothers' Home, even the most basic food was a luxury. People received only one meal, and it was often spoiled or in very small quantities. Some prisoners had to attack others for a piece of bread. Hunger and violence made for a struggle for survival, and hunger brought violence. People who fought for food or who refused to work were brutally beaten by the guards of the facility. Sticks, chains, even metal pipes were used for this. Torture was everywhere. Forced labor, modern slavery. But it was not just a prison, it was also a forced labor camp. They were used as unpaid labor, from field labor to construction projects. But what were they working for? The director of Brothers' Home and the owners of the facility made a lot of money. People's labor lined their pockets. The prisoners never saw a dime. More beatings and hunger awaited those who refused to work. Those who tried to escape were killed. Yes, you have not heard wrong. These people were not only enslaved, but their right to life was also taken away. And children. The destruction of innocence. Now we come to the most painful part of this story. The children. There were hundreds of children in Brothers' home. Some without families, others taken from the streets by the police. And these children were subjected to the same treatment as adults: beatings, starvation, forced labor. The children's souls were destroyed within the dark walls of this facility. Some witnesses even say that children died from the beatings. Others survived the trauma but never adapted to life. Surviving in the shadow of fear meant that to survive at Brothers' home, you had to be part of a system. You had to keep quiet, follow the rules, and not rebel, because the guards punished even the smallest resistance with death. Those who tried to escape from the facility were either captured and killed, or tortured horribly to intimidate the other inmates. Worst of all, these people were forgotten in the outside world. Separated from their families, ostracized by society, they never had a voice here. For them, this place was a tomb. Moreover, people were made to play various deadly games by the guards, turning people's lives into entertainment for someone. The guards would bet on the prisoners and make them play various dangerous games. This is exactly where Squid Game's children's games come from. In fact, the games played in Squid Game, which we watched as a TV series, were inspired by those little games that were made both children and adults play at the cost of their lives in Brothers' home. Brothers' home. With its inhumane conditions, it is not a rehabilitation center but a torture camp, a place where people are condemned to slavery, silence, and pain in order to survive. But this story does not end here. We will soon move on to how we learned about this hell, and how those responsible were held accountable. The revelation of the scandal. With journalist Kim Young-won, the truth is finally coming to light. The horrors at Brothers' home were hidden from the public for years, but it was impossible to keep dark secrets hidden for so long, because the truth had to come out somehow. So how did this horrific story come to light? What happened inside the facility, and who uncovered the truth? Let's take a look. In 1987, there was a brave journalist, Kim Young-won. He fought hard to expose the horrific events at Brothers' home. Let's not forget that at that time, the press in South Korea was largely controlled by the government. It was fraught with great danger for journalists to uncover the truth, but Kim Young-won did not ignore this reality. Witnesses and documents confronting the facts. Kim Young-won found and spoke to a prisoner who had managed to escape from the facility. He described in detail the atrocities he had seen: beatings, forced labor, sexual abuse of children, everything. But the journalist's biggest challenge was to prove all these terrible facts. Kim Young did not only take the testimonies of witnesses, but also did his own research. Documents from former employees, secret police reports, letters from prisoners. All this evidence revealed the dark side of Brom. As a result, it was a place isolated from people, with little way in or out. But these documents were not favorable to the government and the facility managers. Threats, pressure, and even assassination attempts against Kim Young-won began. But the journalist never backed down. Protests began. Justice was now being demanded. The truth that Kim Young had uncovered shook the whole country. Protests began. People demanded the justice people deserved. But the government tried to minimize this scandal. They just called it bad governance and tried to cover it up. It was at this point that Brom's true face was exposed. But the question is the confrontation complete? Have those responsible been punished? Have those responsible gone unpunished? As a result of Kim Young's documents and witness testimony, the plant manager and several senior officials were brought to justice, but sentencing was extremely slow and incomplete. Many of them received short prison sentences and were later released. Some of the truth about the honey has been revealed, but not all of what really happened. Justice has not yet been done for every victim. Many victims continue to live with years of trauma. Brothers' Home will remain a dark page in South Korea. Thanks to the bravery of journalist Kim Yong, it is etched in the public memory, but let us not forget that such horrific events of the past can be repeated today. History is written to learn lessons, not to repeat them. In the early years of the trial, people seeking justice still did not trust the state. Many victims and families said that no one was helping them and that their faith in the state was broken. Some witnesses complained that their testimonies were withheld due to pressure and threats in the courts. Documents kept secret were kept in the hands of the state, and the fear of witnesses revealing the truth increased constantly. Some victims gave up testifying in court cases. They said that the state was scaring them more than helping them. Sometimes repeated questions in the courts drove victims into deeper despair. Even today, some victims and their families are still seeking justice. But the state's process of healing old wounds is still incomplete and challenging, even years later. People are determined to fight until they finally get justice. Hundreds of people disappeared in Brothers' Home. Some were killed, others disappeared, and their families lived for years without knowing their fate. People who were not on the books at the time disappeared under the silent tyranny of the state. There are still people missing today. Their families are determined to search for them forever, but the state is still not ready to face the situation. Let's talk about the similarities with Squid Game. Let's make some connections. What was in Squid Game? The systematically oppressed poor were turned into entertainment for the rich. What about Brothers' Home? The poor, the orphans, the homeless, they were all rounded up and exploited by the system. It was a struggle for survival. That, and in Brothers' Home, people were just struggling to survive. Both show the dark side of social inequality. Imagine, people had to kill each other for a piece of dry, stale bread. And I emphasize again, there were very young children here. There was all kinds of humiliation, contempt, beatings, and psychological violence. And children, in Squid Game, children's games were given a dark meaning. In Brothers' Home, children experienced real darkness. They were beaten, starved, and much, much more. They lived a traumatized life. So what does this event tell us? The biggest lesson of history is that we should not forget it, because if history is forgotten, it repeats. When I was watching Squid Game, it was criticizing that brutal system. But maybe that system is still in place somewhere. True stories are much more fascinating than dramas. If you want to hear such interesting and shocking stories, subscribe now and don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. See you in our next video. Take care and bye!